Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first flipped APES lesson. So we're going to be talking today about ecosystems, and this is really kind of the introduction to the interconnected nature of the world we live in, and so we're going to just jump right in. So before we can talk about an ecosystem, we probably need to define what a system is. And so from a scientific perspective, we define a system as a group of components that function and interact in some regular way. So we can have a system in the scientific sense. We can talk about the human body and the way that all of its different components interact with one another. We could talk about a network. When we're talking about a computer network, that's a system. We could be talking about an economy. We could be talking about an ecosystem, like a river. So all systems have some characteristics in common. They have three key components. They have inputs, things that come into the system and may have an impact on the system. They have flows, so those are sometimes called throughputs, or they may have storage. And usually there's both components to a system. And then, of course, from a system, you have outputs. So that's what the system puts out. When we talk about an ecosystem, we are talking about a community, and that community consists of interacting organisms as well as their physical environment. So let's kind of explore some of those inputs and some of the ways that those inputs can affect a system. So you'll hear us talk this year a lot about something called a feedback loop. So when we have a change to a system, it can impact that system if the system is in equilibrium, or what we will sometimes in biology call homeostasis. Changes can impact that system in one of two ways. They can either amplify that change, meaning that we call that a positive feedback loop, or they can diminish a change, and we call that a negative feedback loop. So a positive feedback loop, the input comes in and it amplifies the system. A negative feedback loop will actually diminish that change. So let's talk about an example. You guys might be familiar with the fact that when fruit ripens, particularly things like apples and bananas, they release a chemical compound called ethylene gas. So if you were to look at a basket full of apples, if some of them are a little bit underripe, as soon as one of them starts to ripen, it releases ethylene gas. Well, when it releases that ethylene gas, that causes the other fruit to ripen. Well, now the more ripe fruit is going to release more ethylene gas. And so that's going to cause more apples to ripen. And so you get this sort of snowballing effect, or what we call a positive feedback loop. On the other hand, coming back to the human body example, we can talk about a negative feedback loop, in that when you get hot, you get overheated. We all know that we sweat when we get hot. And sweat has the effect of cooling us through evaporative cooling. And so that change, that initiation of sweating, actually diminishes that feedback loop. And so that keeps us in what we call homeostasis. It's how our body regulates its own temperature. If you get too cooled off from the sweating, then your body will start to shiver or have a reaction that will warm you back up again. And so a negative feedback loop tends to just stay fairly steady, whereas a positive feedback loop, the input or the change is going to amplify that loop. So if we were to talk about an environmental example of a positive feedback loop, we might talk about the fact that as our climate warms, it causes sea ice to melt. Well, sea ice is very reflective, meaning that it doesn't absorb a lot of the energy from the sun. And so as that sea ice melts and we have more ocean surface does absorb energy from the sun. That means that it gets warmer. And so that one change of this global warming, leading to sea ice melting, leading to decreased reflection, leads to increased global warming. And so that loop continues to amplify the change and increase the overall temperature change. On the other hand, our ecosystems are very complex and complicated systems. And so you could also talk about another effect of global warming, is that it can sometimes cause increased evaporation, which can lead to increased cloud formation, which leads to increased reflection, which then causes temperatures to drop. And so that can be a negative feedback loop. So when we talk about our environment, when we talk about ecosystems, it's important to understand that there are a lot of different loops and they may be interacting in different ways. Okay, let's talk about this basics of an ecosystem. So in our illustration here, we're going to start at the lowest level of our organization of the ecosystem, and that's the individual. So in this illustration, our individual is represented by the one elk here. And so an individual is one organism. Remember that an organism is a living thing. This can be an animal, it can be a plant, it can even be bacteria or fungi. Now, when we talk about a population, we're talking about a group of individuals of the same species. So again, in our illustration, we have a herd of elk. It's important to remember when we talk about a population that a population is all individuals of the same species. So moving up one more layer of complexity, we come to a community. And a community is all the living organisms in an area. So now we're not just talking about the elk, we've added in moose, and we've added in bobcat and beaver and hares and owls, as well as all of the plant species. So you can see that we have grasses and trees and shrubs. So it's all the living organisms, not just the animals and not just that particular species. And then when we move up one more layer of complexity, we reach what we call the ecosystem, which is all the living and non-living things in an area. So now we're adding in the interaction between those living things and the non-living things, the soil, the rocks, the water, the air. And then we'll also talk in our next section about biomes. So a biome is a large area that has similar climate conditions, and those climate conditions actually determine what plants and animal species live there. So for example, a tropical rainforest, no matter where you find a tropical rainforest on the earth, it shares certain characteristics of the amount of rain that it receives, the amount of the average annual temperature, and the types of animals that live there and plants. Okay, so that's our ecosystem basics. Now let's talk about how these different organisms interact within the ecosystem. So we're going to talk about 5 different types of organism interactions, and there is a little bit of overlap between a couple of them, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So the first one we're going to talk about is predation. The first one we're going to talk about is competition. So competition is when you have organisms fighting over a resource. That resource might be food, it might be shelter, it might be moisture, it might be nutrients. In the case of competition, both species or organisms are going to be negatively impacted because there's just not enough of a resource to go around. And so that's going to have a negative impact on both species. The next one we're going to talk about then is predation. And this is where one organism is eating another organism, using it for energy. We typically think of predation with hunters, but we can also think of herbivores as predators. They eat plants. We can even talk about predation when we talk about the parasite type of relationship. So parasitism is when you have a relationship that benefits one organism and harms the other. So ticks might be a good example of this. Or lampreys. Okay, so let's talk about our symbiotic interactions then. So symbiosis means 2 organisms that live in close contact with one another. And then we have 3 different categories of symbiotic types of interactions. The first one is something called mutualism. There you have a relationship that benefits both organisms, and we'll use a coral reef as our example of mutualism, and I will talk about this in more detail. We can have something called commensalism. So that's a symbiotic relationship. They live in close contact with one another, and it benefits one organism, but it does not impact the other at all, not negatively or positively. And then, of course, our final type of symbiotic relationship is parasitism. And parasitism is a relationship that benefits one organism, but it harms the other. So let's talk a little bit about predation. Remember when we talk about predation that it is benefit to one organism and harm to the other. So it's important to recognize that we consider herbivory as a form of predation. Our plant eaters eat plants for energy. This harms the plant that it eats and benefits the herbivore. So as an example, we might think of a giraffe eating the leaves off of a tree. What we typically think of as predators or true predators are our carnivores. They kill and eat prey for their energy. You may also find scavengers in this category because they're eating prey. So when we think about the giraffe again, now the giraffe is the prey and the leopard is the predator. And so it's of damage to the giraffe and of benefit to the leopard. And then we can also talk about parasitism as a form of predation. Parasites use a host organism for their energy. Frequently, they do so without killing the host. You think about getting a tick, it might make you sick, it might harm you, it certainly takes a little blood from you, but it frequently doesn't actually kill you. Mosquitoes are parasites, tapeworms are parasites. When we think about a sea lamprey, those are sort of like sea leeches. Right, so here's a sea lamprey. You can see that it's attached onto this fish and it's feeding off of the fish's blood, which does cause harm to the fish. And then we also have a particular category of parasites called parasitoids. These lay their eggs inside a host organism and the eggs hatch and the larvae eat the host from the inside out to provide themselves with energy. This is a very common survival tactic for insects. So here's an image of a parasitic wasp laying its eggs inside a caterpillar. Those eggs will then hatch and eat the caterpillar as their food source. Here's an image of a tomato hornworm that has had eggs laid in it by a parasitic wasp again. So these are all the eggs, and as those larvae hatch, they will actually eat the tomato hornworm. Okay, so symbiosis. As I said, symbiosis means two organisms living in close contact, sym meaning together, bio meaning living, osis is condition. So this is a living together condition. So symbiosis refers to any close and long-term interaction between two organisms of different species. We said mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism are all symbiotic relationships. When you talk about mutualism, we're talking about organisms of different species that are living closely together in a way that benefits both species. So an example of this would be corals or coral reefs. The coral is a living animal. It provides a structure. It builds an exoskeleton out of calcium carbonate. And that structure provides a place for algae to live. It also provides carbon dioxide to the algae for their photosynthetic process. The algae provide sugars, which the corals then use as energy because the algae are photosynthesizers. So they depend on one another and both of them benefit from that situation. So you can see here we have an image of a coral. This is the coral polyp, and in each of the little fingers of the coral polyp, you'll have algae living inside the cells, and it helps the coral to grow and it provides an environment for the algae. Another example of symbiosis and of mutualism are lichens. Lichens consist of both a fungus and an algae, and they live together. The fungus provides nutrients for the algae, and the algae provides sugars or energy for the fungus. So here's an example of a lichen. This is a particularly attractive and easy to see one, but you guys have seen these all over different plants and logs. They're usually very flat. Okay, so we've talked about predation. We've talked about symbiotic relationships. Our last relationship that we need to talk about is competition. And so in competition, this is always going to reduce the population size of both organisms because there's a limited number of resources available, which means that fewer organisms are going to be able to survive because they have to share those resources. There are lots of different survival strategies that are adopted when there is competition. One of those is called resource partitioning. And when we have resource partitioning, we have different species using the same resource in different ways in order to reduce competition. So we sometimes have what we call temporal partitioning, meaning by time. That means that two animals or organisms might use the same resource at different times. So wolves tend to hunt at different times from coyotes, and even though they're preying on many of the same species, by not hunting at the same time, there's less competition. We also talk about spatial partitioning. So that might be using different areas of a shared habitat. We rarely think of competition when it comes to plants, but it is important to recognize that plants compete for resources. So if we're thinking about a prairie environment where we might have this black grass and this tar bush, you can see that the tar bush has much, much longer and deeper roots. And the grass has very shallow roots. So the tar bush is able to tap into water and nutrients from much deeper in the soil than the grass. And so that would be an example of spatial partitioning. Another example of spatial partitioning would be the same plant being used, different areas of the plant being used by different species. So you can see here that we have an example with 5 different warblers, so 5 different species of birds, and they all live in the same type and even the same tree, but they use different parts of it. And so by using different areas of that shared habitat, they're able to share that resource without affecting the population size of any of them as much. And then our last type of partitioning is what we call morphological partitioning. So this is where different organisms will use different resources based on different evolution of the body features. And so you can see that a black-footed ferret and an ermine have very different tooth structures, which means that they're going to eat very different organisms, even though they live in the same area and are very similar animals. And ermine is the animal that you guys might know as a mink. So they are wild animals, although they're also now farmed for fur. Okay, and we will do this practice FRQ in class together. So make sure you make notes of any of your questions and let me know first thing in class tomorrow. Look forward to seeing you.